On a cold winter evening, the city streets are eerily quiet, the sky darkened by the thick clouds overhead and the harsh wind biting at the skin of anyone brave enough to be outside. The chill is so deep it feels as if it cuts through to the bone. But for one man, this night will become a memory he won't soon forget. He's just finished a long shift at work and is walking home down the empty streets, hands buried deep in his coat pockets, trying to shield himself from the cold, his breath forming small clouds in the freezing air, his steps quick but steady. He's been down this path 1,000 times, and tonight, like every other night, it feels like the weight of the day is finally lifting when out of nowhere 2 figures step out from the darkness of an alleyway. He barely has time to react before they block his path. He stops instinctively, his body tense as the figures become clearer under the dim light of the street lamps. 2 police officers, both dressed in dark blue uniforms, their faces expressionless, their eyes scanning him with cold authority. The man's heart skips a beat, his nerves rising for no reason other than the simple truth that he has no idea why they're stopping him. One of the officers steps forward, his gaze sharp, as if he's seen something suspicious in the way the man carries himself. He asks him if he has anything to hide, his voice a little too forceful for a simple question. The man blinks, taken off guard by the sudden interrogation, and stammers that he's just walking home from work. But the officer doesn't seem to care. His eyes narrow, and without another word, he commands the man to stop and drop to the ground. In confusion, the man looks up at the officer, unsure of what's going on. His hands instinctively clutch his coat tighter to his body. He's already cold, but now he feels the weight of the situation settle in. The second officer crosses his arms, waiting without a word as the first officer repeats the order more harshly. The man hesitates for just a moment, wondering if this is some kind of joke. But as the officers stare him down, he realizes it's not. He can feel the growing tension in the air. They're serious, and there's no room for questions. The officer speaks again, his voice now cold and demanding, his words chilling as he orders the man to perform push-ups right there in the street. The man stands frozen, his mind racing. How could this be happening? Why would they make him do something so absurd? He looks around, but the street is empty. The cold wind whips around him, biting at his face. And he knows there's no one to help him, no one to witness what's going on. He doesn't know what to do, but he knows he can't refuse. The officers will not let him walk away, so with a resigned sigh, he lowers himself to the ground, his palms raw against the pavement. He's not prepared for the strain on his body, not prepared for the cold that seems to seep into every muscle, but he begins anyway, his arms shaking from the first push-up as the officers stand by watching his every move, their eyes cold and judgmental. It's clear they're not interested in his reasons or excuses. They only care about making him suffer. In that moment, the man wonders if it's just him or if there's something more to this cruelty. The man's muscles begin to ache almost immediately, his arms trembling from the cold and strain with each push-up. He forces his body up and down as the freezing pavement bites at his palms. The cold air cuts through him like 1,000 tiny needles, and each breath feels like ice. His chest heaves as he pushes against the force of gravity, his body not used to this sudden exertion. But the officers stand still, their eyes locked on him, their faces unreadable. The only sound in the night is the man's labored breathing and the harsh crunch of his body moving against the cold ground. The officers make no move to help him, no signs of compassion. They only watch as if the scene before them is something to be observed with indifference. One of the officers smirks and mutters something under his breath, the words barely audible, but sharp enough for the man to hear it clearly. It's a cruel joke, a taunt disguised as encouragement. It makes the man's blood boil, but he grits his teeth and continues pushing himself harder than before, determined to prove he won't be broken. The cold seeps deeper into his bones with each passing second. His fingers begin to numb, his palms feel raw, but he pushes through the pain. Sweat mixes with the cold on his forehead and drips down his face. Despite the chill in the air, his body feels hot from the exertion. Every muscle in his arms screams for relief, but still he keeps going. The officers seem to enjoy watching him struggle. One of them occasionally makes a sarcastic remark about how weak he looks, how much longer he's going to last, but the man doesn't respond. Not a word escapes his lips. He can't afford to show weakness. Not now, not when they're trying to break him. They want to see him quit. They want to see him beg for mercy. But he refuses to give them that satisfaction. Each time he drops to the ground and forces himself back up, he does it with the thought that no matter how cruel they are, he won't let them win. The seconds stretch into minutes, and still they stand there unmoving, their expressions unchanged. The cold begins to feel like it's crawling under his skin. His body is shaking from the effort, his mind starting to slip from the pain, but he keeps his focus locked on the task at hand, his arms burning, his legs threatening to give out beneath him. He's not sure how much longer he can last, but he knows that if he stops now, they'll have won. It's then that the second officer speaks up, his voice dripping with mockery, telling the man to push harder. As if it's not enough, as if he's not already suffering enough, the first officer joins in, both of them, now enjoying the spectacle before them. Each push-up feels like a test of his resolve, a test he never asked for but now must endure. He wonders how far they're willing to take it, how much further they want to push him. But even in that moment of doubt, a fire ignites in him, something deeper than anger, a quiet strength that refuses to back down. No matter the cost, no matter the cold, he will not break. He will finish this. The man's body is on the edge of collapse. Each push-up feels like a mountain he has to climb over and over. His arms feel as if they're made of lead. His palms burn and sting against the unforgiving pavement, but he forces himself to keep going. The cold air fills his lungs and makes each breath painful, as though the very act of breathing is an effort. The muscles in his chest and shoulders ache with a sharp intensity, but still he doesn't stop. The officers stand over him with a quiet intensity that feels suffocating, their eyes never leaving him. Not for a second. They watch as he struggles with every movement. Their presence is a constant reminder of how powerless he feels, but he refuses to give them the satisfaction of seeing him falter. Each time his arms press against the cold concrete and his chest lowers closer to the ground, he feels the weight of the world on his back, but he won't stop. He can't stop. The second officer grins, a cruel smile spreading across his face. As the man continues to struggle, it's clear now that this isn't just about testing his physical endurance. This is about something deeper. They want to break him. They want to see him beg. They want to see him grovel for mercy. But the man holds his ground in silence. Each time he pushes himself back up, he does so with the knowledge that he's proving something to them, but more importantly to himself. His breath comes in ragged gasps. His vision begins to blur as the exhaustion and cold seep deeper into his body. But he keeps pushing up against the pain, even as it intensifies. Every muscle in his arms quivers in protest, and he feels as if his body might give out, but still he doesn't stop. The officers continue to watch in silence, their faces unreadable. They're not interested in his reasons. They don't care about his struggle. They just want to see how far he'll go, how much he can take before he collapses at their feet. But he knows if he falls into that trap, he'll lose something far more important than the ability to perform push-ups. He'll lose his dignity. The man's mind is racing with each passing second, wondering how much longer this will last, wondering if they'll ever let him stop. The cold is numbing his fingers, but he pushes through it, his body moving on instinct. Now more than thought, he can barely feel his arms anymore, as if they've become disconnected from the rest of his body. But he still continues. The second officer watches him closely, now his eyes narrowed with amusement, as if the man's pain is nothing more than a form of entertainment. The first officer remains silent, arms crossed, watching the scene unfold with the detached air of someone who's seen this play out before. But for the man, this is not a game, it's a battle, and he won't surrender. He won't let them win. Every time his body threatens to give up, he reminds himself of what's at stake. This is about more than just proving his strength. This is about showing the officers that they can't break him, they can't make him submit, they can't strip him of his will to stand tall. His breath is ragged and uneven as the cold continues to cut through him. With each push-up, his body feels like it's at war with itself, muscles screaming in protest, his chest burning as though a fire is coursing through his veins. But he keeps going. Each movement feels more mechanical than the last. Each time his arms shake violently as he presses his body back up, his vision blurs. But he's determined to stay focused. His thoughts are a jumbled mess of frustration and anger. But through it all, there's a single thought that keeps him grounded. He won't let them break him. He won't let them see him fail. The officers stand over him, silent now, the second officer still wearing that twisted grin on his face. But there's something darker behind it now, as if he's starting to question whether or not the man will finally give in. The first officer doesn't smile or speak, his eyes cold and steady like a predator watching its prey. Every push-up is a battle, and yet the man refuses to quit. Every time he goes down and comes back up, he does it with a defiance that only grows stronger with the pain. The officers have no idea what they unleashed with their cruelty. They think they can wear him down, make him beg for mercy, but what they don't realize is that with every moment they prolong this humiliation, they're only fueling the fire within him. The cold is no longer a factor, it's a distant memory. His whole focus is now on the push-ups, on proving that no matter how hard they push, no matter how much they torment him, he will not fold, he will not break. His body is exhausted, every muscle aching as though it might snap, but he keeps going. His arms tremble violently with each push. But his resolve is unshakable. He's no longer thinking about the cold, the pain, or the officers. All that matters now is that he keeps moving up and down. The laughter from the officers fades into the background as the man pushes his limits, his body screaming for him to stop. But his mind refuses. The second officer calls out to him in a mocking tone, telling him to pick up the pace, as if this was some sort of game. The words cut through the air, but they only strengthen his resolve. He'll never give them the satisfaction of seeing him falter. He'll never give them the satisfaction of seeing him broken. Each time he presses back up, it's like a silent middle finger to their twisted amusement. The first officer shifts his weight slightly, But his expression remains unchanged, his gaze never leaving the man's body. Not once does he blink, not once does he show even a hint of sympathy. It's as though the man is nothing more than a machine to him, nothing more than an object to be used and discarded. The second officer makes another snide remark about how long the man is going to last, but it only fuels the fire inside the man. Every word makes him push harder, every taunt strengthens his will. The minutes feel like hours, but still the man keeps going. Each push-up is a step further into his own strength, further into the realization that this is about more than just physical endurance. It's about reclaiming his dignity. It's about making sure they know that he won't be broken, he won't be defeated no matter how hard they try. The minutes stretch on endlessly and the man's body feels like it's no longer his own. Each push-up takes everything he has left, and yet he refuses to stop. His arms are trembling uncontrollably, and his legs are beginning to give way, but he forces himself back up. The cold air bites into his skin, but it's nothing compared to the fire burning inside him. Every fiber of his being is focused on one thing. He will not let them break him. They can't take his strength away. They can't take his pride. As his arms collapse under him for what feels like the 100th time, he barely catches himself before hitting the pavement, but his resolve never wavers. His hands are raw and bloody, but he doesn't care. The second officer steps forward, his voice dripping with sarcasm as he orders the man to keep going. He tells him that if he really wants to prove something, he should keep pushing himself, that he's not done yet. The words slice through the night like a knife, but the man doesn't flinch. His eyes stay focused on the ground below him as he pulls himself back up. Once again, his body is screaming at him to stop, but he presses on. Each push-up is now a test of will, not of strength. His arms are so weak, they barely hold him up. But still he doesn't stop. The officers are silent for a moment as they watch him struggle, their expressions unreadable. But the silence only makes the moment feel heavier, the coldness between them all hanging in the air like a cloud, suffocating every breath. The man's vision begins to fade as he goes down again. His body is starting to give out, but there's something deeper than pain that drives him forward, a quiet determination that refuses to let him fall. This is no longer about the push-ups. This is about something more. This is about standing tall in the face of cruelty and proving that no matter what they do to him, he will never be broken. He hears the second officer mutter something under his breath, but he can't make out the words. It doesn't matter anymore. Everything has become a blur of pain and focus. Every part of his body feels as though it's being pulled apart piece by piece. But still he keeps going even when his vision blurs and the world around him spins. Even when the ground beneath him starts to tilt, he forces himself back up one more time. His mind is drifting, but he clings to the thought that if he can just keep going, they will know he's not their puppet. He will never be their toy. He pushes himself up again, the sound of his breath and the pounding at his heart, the only things that remain real in that moment. The officers haven't said a word for some time, but the weight of their presence still looms over him as he pushes through the pain, his body aching and weak, every muscle telling him to stop. But he won't stop. He can't stop. And then finally, after what feels like an eternity, they stop watching. He hears them speak to each other in low voices, and the man's heart races. For a moment he wonders if they'll make him do more, but then the voice of the first officer breaks through, telling him to stand up and that he's had enough. The man struggles to push himself off the cold pavement. His arms feel like jelly beneath him, his fingers numb and raw from the friction against the rough concrete. Every part of him aches as he slowly stands, his legs wobbling as if they might collapse underneath him. The cold air stains his skin, but it feels like nothing compared to the exhaustion that has settled deep within his bones. His body is shaking uncontrollably, his vision still hazy. But the moment he stands fully erect, he locks his eyes on the officers. Not a word leaves his mouth. He doesn't say anything as he looks up at them, but in that glance there's something they can't ignore, something they didn't expect to see. There's no begging, there's no plea for mercy, just a quiet defiance. The first officer steps forward, his face still hard and expressionless, but there's a flicker of something in his eyes, maybe surprise, maybe doubt. But it's quickly masked with a cold indifference. The second officer watches him with a smug grin, still not fully understanding what he's just witnessed. He expected to see the man broken, a shell of the person he was when they first ordered him to do the push-ups. But instead the man is standing tall, his chest heaving with each ragged breath. But there's a strength there, a quiet force they hadn't anticipated. The officers exchange a glance, almost as if trying to decide whether or not to say something more. But the man remains silent. He doesn't need to say anything. They've already seen enough. His silence is more powerful than any words he could speak. The first officer gives a sharp nod, as if signaling the end of the ordeal, and the second officer looks at the man one last time before turning away. They start walking without another word, their footsteps echoing in the quiet street. The man doesn't move right away. He watches them leave, his chest still heavy with the weight of the last few minutes, his legs shaking beneath him. But he doesn't drop to the ground. He doesn't show any sign of weakness. He just stands there watching them disappear into the darkness. His body feels as though it might collapse at any moment, but he's not done yet. He can feel something stirring within him, a quiet fury building in his chest. It's not over, not yet. As the cold wind whips around him, he takes a slow, steady breath, trying to gather himself, his hands trembling, but his mind is already working on what to do next. He knows this isn't the end. He can't just let it go, not after everything they put him through. He knows he has to make them pay. He has to make them see that what they did wasn't just an act of power. It was an abuse of authority, and he won't let it slide. He stands in the empty street for a few more moments, his thoughts racing, his mind already planning his next move. The humiliation, the pain, all of it is still fresh in his mind. But so does the sense of strength he's found in himself, a strength he didn't know he had, and now he's going to use it against them. He turns and heads home, his steps slow but steady, each one filled with the quiet knowledge that this isn't the last they'll hear from him. He'll make sure of that. The man walks through the dark streets, his mind buzzing with thoughts of what just happened and what's to come. He's never been one to back down from a challenge, but this situation feels different. It feels deeper than any physical confrontation he's ever had before. He's been humiliated and pushed to his limits by those who are supposed to protect the public, and something inside him stirs a need for justice, a need to make sure they understand that their actions won't go unanswered. As he walks home, his body still aching from the strain, he can't shake the feeling that this isn't just about what happened tonight. It's about standing up for what's right, about making sure that people in positions of power don't forget that they are accountable for their actions. The wind cuts through him as he turns a corner, and the chill reminds him of what he just endured, the harsh cold against his raw skin. But it doesn't matter anymore. The pain fades into the background, replaced by a burning desire to right the wrongs done to him and to anyone else who might find themselves in the same position. The man knows he's not the first person to have been treated this way, and he won't be the last, but he also knows he won't stand idly by while others are subjected to the same cruel treatment. The next day he wakes early with a quiet resolve, his body sore and tired from the previous night's ordeal, but his mind is sharp as ever. He dresses quickly and heads out into the cold, once more, this time with purpose. He knows what he has to do. The police officers who subjected him to that humiliation need to answer for their actions, and he's going to make sure they do. He spends the morning gathering information, looking into complaints against the officers, and researching his options for taking action. It's not easy, but he's determined he can't let this slide. He knows that if he's going to make a difference, he needs to be smart about it. He can't just charge in recklessly. He has to be prepared. Later that afternoon, he walks into the local police station with a sense of calm confidence, his steps steady, his mind focused. The officers at the front desk don't give him a second glance. They're too busy with their paperwork and phone calls, but he doesn't care. He's here for a reason, and he's not leaving until he's spoken to the right person. He asks to speak with a superior officer, someone in charge, someone who can listen to his complaint and take it seriously. The receptionist doesn't seem to think much of it, but she nods and picks up the phone. Moments later, a senior officer appears, a tall man with a stern expression and a sharp gaze. The man's heart races for a moment, but he doesn't back down. He stands tall and meets the officer's eyes as they exchange pleasantries. He takes a deep breath and begins telling his story, explaining what happened the night before, how he was forced to do push-ups in the freezing cold, how he was humiliated by two officers who showed no concern for his well-being. The officer listens carefully, his expression unreadable, but the man can tell he's paying attention. This isn't just a story, this is something he's going to take seriously. And the man feels a small sense of satisfaction at the thought that the officers who wronged him will finally have to answer for what they did. The officer doesn't interrupt as the man speaks. He listens with an air of professionalism, but there's something in his eyes that suggests he's taking the complaint seriously. The man doesn't rush through the details. He carefully recounts everything from the cold streets to the brutal push-ups to the officer's taunts and mocking remarks. He makes sure to explain how he was treated not just as a suspect, but as an object of amusement. The senior officer nods, occasionally taking notes and asking a few clarifying questions, but for the most part, he lets the man speak the entire time. The man holds his ground, not backing down, not flinching under the weight of the situation. When he's done explaining, the senior officer looks at him for a moment without saying anything, his gaze steady and thoughtful. Then he asks a few more questions about what happened after the man was ordered to stop the push-ups, and whether he was offered any medical attention. He answers truthfully, though he can still feel the sting of the humiliation. It's all part of the process now, though, and he knows it's necessary. After a brief pause, the officer finally speaks with a measured tone, saying that he'll launch an investigation into the matter. He doesn't make any promises right away, but his words are firm and reassuring enough to let the man know that something is going to be done. He thanks the officer and turns to leave, But before he walks out, the senior officer calls after him with a softer tone. He asks if the man would be willing to come back and get a formal statement if they need him to in the future. The man doesn't hesitate. He agrees, knowing that this isn't just about him anymore. This is about making sure that this kind of treatment doesn't happen to anyone else. He leaves the station with a sense of purpose, the weight of what's happening now settling in. It's no longer just a matter of retaliation, it's about accountability. It's about making sure that those who are supposed to protect and serve are held to the same standards as anyone else. Later that night, as the man sits at home, he reflects on the day's events and what it means for the future. He knows this isn't the end of the story. There's still a long road ahead, and the investigation is just the beginning, but in some ways he feels a sense of peace for the first time since that night. He's taken the first step toward justice, and he knows that whatever happens next, he won't be silenced, he won't back down, and the officers who treated him like a joke will soon realize that their actions come with consequences. The following week, the man receives a call from the senior officer informing him that the investigation has begun, and that the officers in question are being questioned about the incident. He's asked to come in again to provide further details. As the man heads back to the station, he feels a new kind of strength, not from physical power, but from the knowledge that he's making a difference, that his voice is being heard. The man arrives at the station with a quiet determination, his steps purposeful and steady. The building feels colder than usual today, as if the very walls are holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. He's escorted to a small room where he's asked to wait as the officer who called him in prepares the paperwork. He doesn't mind the wait, he's used to it now. The silence in the room doesn't bother him. It gives him time to think, time to reflect on how far he's come from that cold night on the pavement. His body may still ache, but his spirit feels stronger than ever. He knows the road ahead isn't going to be easy, but he's ready for it. After a few minutes, the senior officer walks in and sits across from him. The man notices the serious expression on his face and the stack of papers in his hands. The officer doesn't waste any time getting to the point. He tells the man that the investigation is moving forward, and that the two officers involved in the incident are under internal review. They're being questioned about their actions, and their behavior is being scrutinized. The man listens carefully, not saying anything at first. He can feel the weight of what's happening now. The officers are facing consequences, but he knows that the system doesn't always work in favor of the victim. There's still a chance that they could slip through the cracks and get away with it, but he doesn't let doubt creep into his mind. He's come too far to let that happen. The senior officer looks up from the papers and asks if the man is willing to provide a more detailed statement, this time to go over the incident again and explain everything that happened. The days that follow are filled with a quiet anticipation as the man waits for any update on the investigation. Every time his phone rings, his heart races, wondering if it's the officer with news about the case. But each call turns out to be a wrong number or something unrelated. The silence from the station feels deafening as the days stretch on, but he's patient. He knows the process takes time, but that doesn't make the waiting any easier. His thoughts drift back to that cold night, the cruel taunts of the officers, the way they watched him struggle as he pushed himself to the limit. Every moment of that humiliation still lingers in his mind, but he refuses to let it break him. Now his resolve is stronger than ever, and with each passing day, he becomes more determined to see this through. He begins to channel his energy into something productive. He starts working out again. But this time it's not to prove something to anyone else, it's for himself. It's about regaining control over his body and mind. It's about rebuilding the strength that was nearly stripped from him, and with each drop of sweat that falls to the floor, he feels a little more whole again. While the physical pain isn't gone completely, the sense of power he feels in reclaiming his own strength helps numb the emotional toll the officer's actions left on him. He's not going to let them steal that part of him too. Meanwhile, at the station, the investigation moves forward behind closed doors. The officers in question are questioned by internal affairs, and their behavior is scrutinized. It's clear that things aren't looking good for them. The evidence and testimonies are stacking up against them. The two officers involved had tried to claim that the man had been uncooperative or even belligerent, but their stories don't hold up when compared to the accounts of witnesses who were nearby when the incident occurred, and the recordings that were found from the body cameras they had failed to turn off during the encounter. As the investigation progresses, the senior officer who has been handling the case reaches out to the man again. He calls and arranges a meeting to update him on the status of the case. When the man arrives at the station, the officer greets him with a nod, his face serious but not unkind. He leads the man into a small office where they sit across from each other, and the officer hands him a folder containing the details of the investigation. The man's eyes flick over the papers, quickly catching the key points. The officer's testimonies are full of inconsistencies and contradictions, while the man's statement and the testimonies of the witnesses paint a much clearer picture. The officer explains that based on the evidence, the two officers involved in the incident will be facing disciplinary action, and depending on the results of a further review, they could even face termination. The man feels a sense of relief wash over him, but it's not a sense of victory, yet it's more of a quiet acknowledgement that justice might finally be served. But the journey isn't over yet. He still has to wait and see what happens next. He's told that there will be a formal hearing and that he may need to testify again. But for now, he's left with the knowledge that the officers will be held accountable for their actions. The man leaves the station feeling a bit lighter, but he knows that there's still more to come. There's still a fight ahead, but he's ready for it. He's come this far, and he won't stop now. He knows that whatever happens next, he's made a difference. He's taken a stand, and that's something no one can take away from him. The man spends the next few days preparing for the upcoming hearing. His thoughts are a constant whirlwind as he reflects on everything that's led up to this moment. He's been through so much since that cold night on the pavement, but now it feels like everything is coming to a head. He can't help but replay the moment when he first walked into the police station to file his complaint, when he spoke up against the officers who humiliated him, when he decided to take a stand against the abuse of power. Every step since then has felt like a battle, but he hasn't faltered. He's still standing tall. And now he's preparing to face the final leg of this journey. He spends time organizing his thoughts, mentally going over everything he wants to say at the hearing. He wants to make sure his story is clear and undeniable. He doesn't want any room for doubt. As he goes over the details again, the memories of the cold wind biting into his skin, the officer's taunts, and the burning pain of his body pushing against its limits come rushing back. They are vivid and raw, and he realizes that the anger he once felt has been replaced by a quiet resolve. He's not here to fight for revenge or to hurt anyone. He's here to make sure that this never happens again, that no one else will be treated the way he was, that no one else will have to endure that kind of cruelty from those who are supposed to protect and serve. The day of the hearing arrives, and the man walks into the courtroom with the same quiet determination he's felt all along. The room is filled with officers, lawyers, and witnesses, all gathered to hear the case unfold. He's not nervous. He doesn't feel the weight of the room pressing down on him. Instead, he feels focused as he sits and waits for his turn to speak. He knows that this is the moment that will decide everything. This is the time when his voice will finally be heard, when the truth will come to light, when he can show everyone that he won't back down from the injustice. He's faced the officers who humiliated him sit across the room, and though they don't look directly at him, he can feel their presence. It's not lost on him that they likely thought they had the upper hand, that they could intimidate him into submission, but they had no idea who they were dealing with. The man doesn't care about their stares or their whispered conversations. He doesn't care about the people who doubt him or question his motives. He only cares about one thing: making sure that those officers pay for what they did, and making sure that the system holds them accountable for their actions. When it's finally his turn to speak, he rises slowly, walking to the stand with a calm confidence. He takes a deep breath and begins recounting the events of that night. Once again, this time he speaks not just for himself, but for everyone who has suffered at the hands of those who abuse their power. With each word he speaks, his voice is steady, his eyes never wavering from the faces in front of him. He doesn't rush through his story. He lets every detail sink in. He talks about the cold, the pain, and the humiliation, but he also talks about the strength he found within himself, the strength to stand up and demand justice for what was done to him. When he finishes speaking, there's a long silence in the room, and for the first time since all of this began, he allows himself to believe that this might actually be the moment where things change. The silence in the room stretches out like an eternity, and for a moment the man wonders if anyone is even listening, if his words have made any impact at all. The tension is palpable as the room waits for the next move. The officers who had humiliated him sit quietly, their faces unreadable, as the man stands tall before them. But he doesn't look at them anymore. His eyes are focused on the judge and the others present in the room. The lawyers exchange quiet words with the judge before the proceedings continue, and the man feels a slight relief knowing that the attention is no longer just on him, but on the facts of the case. His statement has been heard, and now it's time for the system to do its job. He doesn't know what will happen next, but he knows he has done everything he could. He's spoken the truth and exposed the officers for what they are. It's out of his hands now, but he can't help but wonder if this will be the end, or if it will drag on for months, if the system will truly hold those in power accountable, or if it will fall back into its old ways. The judge speaks, and the room quiets down. The decision is being made. He listens carefully. The words coming from the bench feel distant, almost surreal, but they are also the words he's been waiting for. He hears the judge acknowledge the seriousness of the officer's actions and the need for accountability. The judge speaks of the abuse of power, the violation of trust, and the importance of ensuring that such behavior never happens again. The man feels a knot loosen in his chest. It's not over yet, but it feels like a small victory. It feels like his voice has made a difference. Then the judge delivers the final ruling. The 2 officers involved will face immediate suspension. A full review is conducted into their conduct. If the review finds sufficient cause, they could face dismissal and even criminal charges. The man feels a wave of relief wash over him, though it's tempered by the realization that this is just the beginning. The officers are not yet convicted, but their actions are being scrutinized. They are no longer untouchable. And that is a step in the right direction. As the proceedings wind down, the man feels the weight of the room shift. The officers who had once thought they were above the law now have to answer for their behavior. The man walks out of the courtroom with his head held high. He knows that the battle isn't over, but he feels as though he's won something important. The officers will face consequences, but the bigger victory is in the message it sends to everyone who witnesses this case. It's a message that says abuse of power will not be tolerated. It's a message that says those in positions of authority must be held accountable for their actions. The man walks out of the courthouse knowing that his fight has sparked something bigger. It's not just about him anymore. It's about making sure that no one else ever has to go through what he did. He's proud of what he's accomplished, but he knows that the real work is just beginning. As he steps into the sunlight and breathes in the fresh air, he feels like he's reclaimed a part of himself. He thought he lost a part of him that will never back down again. The man walks away from the courthouse with a quiet sense of accomplishment, but it isn't a feeling of triumph that settles in his chest. Instead, it's something deeper, a quiet understanding that the battle he fought was only one small part of something much larger. As he steps into the busy street, he hears the sounds of the city around him, the chatter of people, the distant hum of traffic. But for the first time in a long while, it all seems distant, almost as if the world around him has faded just a little bit. He's no longer concerned with the whispers or the stares from strangers. He's not thinking about the outcome of the case. He's thinking about the ripple effect, the tiny spark he's ignited by simply standing up for himself. It wasn't just about the 2 officers anymore. It wasn't just about proving something to them or anyone else. It was about making sure that those who abuse their power are held accountable. And in a way, his fight had just begun. He didn't know what would come next. He didn't know if the officers would ultimately be fired or if their careers would continue, but he knew that whatever happened next, the system would have to answer for its failures, and the idea of that filled him with a quiet determination that he hadn't known before. As he walks through the crowded streets, he sees the faces of strangers walking past them, going about their lives unaware of the fight he just fought, unaware of the battle he had won. But for a moment he imagines them seeing him differently, as if they could somehow sense the quiet strength he gained in the process. He feels a strange sense of pride in that thought, and it makes him walk just a little bit taller. He heads home with no grand celebrations, no fireworks, just a calm satisfaction. He's done what he set out to do. But in the back of his mind, he knows there's always more to be done. There's always another injustice to be fought, another person whose voice needs to be heard. The next morning, the phone rings. It's the senior officer calling to inform him that the internal review has concluded, and the officers involved have been suspended pending further investigation. The man listens intently, his heart racing, but he keeps his voice steady as he asks what the next steps will be. The officer tells him that their conduct will be reviewed, and if the evidence is sufficient, criminal charges will be filed. The man nods as he listens, but his thoughts are elsewhere. He's not celebrating yet. He's not even sure if he'll ever truly feel satisfied with the outcome. But he knows that for now the right steps are being taken, and that's enough for him for now. He's won this part of the fight. But he's also aware that this victory isn't just his. It belongs to everyone who has ever been mistreated by those in positions of power. It belongs to everyone who has ever felt powerless in the face of authority. As he hangs up the phone and looks out the window, he takes a deep breath and allows himself a brief moment of peace. The battle isn't over, but for the first time in a long time, he feels like he's on the right side of it. And that is enough for now. He smiles slightly as he walks away from the window, knowing that no matter what comes next, he will always have the strength to stand tall again.